So around this time, I learned in a very difficult way that fear tactics can often have the most impact when something really negative happens. So in June of 2009, I got in a car accident. My husband and my two younger siblings were in the car with me. We had gone out of town on a nice weekend trip to a theme park, and on the way back, I was T-boned by a pickup truck. I was the one driving, so I obviously got the brunt of it. We were very fortunate that my siblings were pretty much unharmed, with the exception of a little bit of whiplash. My husband cracked 2 ribs, and I suffered a traumatic head injury. After the car accident, I was unconscious, slumped over the wheel. Luckily, there was an off-duty paramedic that saw the accident either when it happened or very quickly after it happened, and came and helped. I know that I was air-vac'd to a hospital, which means we took a helicopter. My husband and my siblings went to a non-emergency center that was closer by ambulance. I don't remember any of that day. I don't remember any of the tests they ran me through. I don't remember when my parents showed up. I don't remember when Jim's parents, my husband, showed up. And the reason why this is, as they told my family, and as my family would later tell me, I had something called retrograde amnesia. Now, I know when you think of amnesia, you think of who am I kind of thing. It turns out amnesia is not typically like that, the kind you see in soap operas. Retrograde amnesia is actually a far more common version of amnesia. I lost a few years of my life that I didn't remember at the time. I couldn't remember recent events. I remember at one point thinking that I was still in college, which means that would be about 2 years that I was missing for a while. But over time, over that day, I started kind of getting chunks of my old memory back. Also, my short-term memory was shot that day. I was asking the same questions over and over and over, and my parents said they got very sick of answering the same questions, but they tried to be patient with me because obviously I couldn't help it. So think about it, right? So I'm missing about 2 years. And if you think about this entire series, this series thus far takes place in about 2 years. So think about everything that all the stuff that I've gone through intellectually and emotionally, and just wipe that away for a moment. It was gone because I lost all this memory temporarily, and I started slowly getting some of it back. That night my memory started working a little bit better because I can actually remember that night in the hospital. Remember, everyone was gone. The nurse told me my family had visited, that I had talked with them. I didn't remember it, of course, and so I was starting to think to myself, and I was pretty distraught. I was in a lot of pain. I had a lot of muscle trauma, it turns out. My head hurt, very uncomfortable certainly, and I remember thinking about, like, why did this happen? Why? How did this happen? What happened? You know, all these questions because I didn't remember what happened. I didn't remember even planning the trip that they were talking about with me. And I remember just suddenly there was something that triggered my mind. I turned on the television in the hospital, and there was a show that I happened to have watched about a few weeks ago. And I triggered, like, oh yeah, I remember watching that last Wednesday night. And then I thought, Wednesday night? But I have church Wednesday night. Why would I be watching that Wednesday night a few weeks ago? And then it suddenly occurred to me, it just hit me. Wait a second. I left the church. I wasn't going anymore. It just hit me all at once. Like, I remembered some of the things, but all of a sudden it just occurred to me that I had decided to leave. And I had this moment of just sheer panic, because my first thought, the very first thing I thought after I realized was, I know why this accident happened. I know why this car accident happened. It was because I left the church. I don't even know if I can begin to express in that level of weakness and sadness and pain and confusion, what that's like to feel for even a moment, even a little, the few, I don't know, 30 seconds or a minute that I felt that completely and believed it. I don't think I can describe that, but it was bad. It was a horrible feeling, And I felt like I had put my husband in danger and my siblings in danger because of this, and it was just such a feeling of responsibility. Now luckily, about 30 seconds to a minute after I thought this, I thought to myself, no, that's horrible. That's a horrible thing to say and think, and it's not true. Luckily, with getting those memories back, I remembered what I learned about the church, the manipulation they used, and the fear tactics, the sort of us versus them, and the sort of demonizing the other, or threatening the other people who are against the religion. And they use things like fear tactics to accomplish this. And I remembered that I learned that, and luckily I was able to, even in my weakened, confused state, I was able to say to myself, no. I realized in that exact moment where I had heard that before. I didn't question whether it was God, I didn't question whether it was Satan, I didn't question whether it was myself. I knew exactly who told me that, and that was my pastor. I knew in that moment that sort of bad things are going to happen to you, you're going to go to hell, these sort of things that I've been fighting against in my mind. What I thought, was that God? Was that Satan? Was that myself? Well, I knew right then that, yeah, it was coming from within myself, but I had heard it somewhere before. I'd heard it from my pastor. And I remember right then thinking to myself, I will never go back to that church, ever. I'd always said maybe someday. No. I knew right then, not all of Christianity, but that particular church, that particular pastor, no, never again. And I remember thinking, I want to go home later and double check that he actually said this. I knew that he had in so many words, but I thought, am I blowing this out of proportion? Did he really make that specific threat? Did he say that something bad will happen if you leave the church? I'm pretty sure he did, but I wanted to know exactly for sure. So that was something that was in my mind that I was going to have to do once I got out of the hospital and was feeling up to it. So I got out of the hospital the next day, and most of my memories came back up until a few days before the accident, before I got out of the hospital. I still didn't remember actually going to the theme park, spending time at the theme park, and the next day of the day of the accident. But I was well enough to get out of the hospital. The doctor said, you know, over time I would get better, these symptoms would get better. So we stayed with my parents for about a week, and I remember, even while being there, and I was going through a lot of stuff, my memory was still really not great, I was starting to notice really bad migraines, there's a lot of symptoms I was starting to deal with, but I wasn't fully aware. But I was off of work, which was so weird for me. I was so used to being like a workaholic, and I still had this nagging feeling of, I need to find out if my pastor actually said those things. So that's how I was still angry. I remembered that. That was one of the clearest memories I had right after my accident. So I had some CDs of his, but I didn't have them with me because I was at my parents' house. So I typed in his name, and it turns out he actually had some of his sermons posted online. They were from a few years ago, but I thought that was perfect. That would be the time I would have actually still been in church, and I would have been hearing these things. So I looked at some of the titles, and I looked at things that looked promising to actually see if I could find where he had actually made these claims. I was even a little bit surprised that it only took me clicking on 2 sermons to find an exact passage where he said those things. Now, I have a good portion of the sermon typed here on my computer, but I'm only going to read you a small passage just to give you a taste. Sometimes as Christians we forget that as much as we have a Lord that wants us to be saved, there is a devil that wants us to be lost. As a roaring lion, he is seeking to devour you. If the devil has his way in your life, it won't just be a bite wound, you will be devoured. The devil would like to sift you as wheat. Don't think the devil wants you to just leave the church. That's just the first step. Because once he gets you away from the church, he's going to continue the downward spiral that you began when you stepped away from God. He will attack your marriage, he will attack your health, he will attack your children. He will not stop until he devours you. That's just one section of it, and as you can imagine, I was pretty horrified, but at least I knew what this was coming from now. And even though I didn't believe it was true, there was a small part of me that thought, well, maybe this all did happen because I left church. Maybe God did take his protection off me. Maybe the devil did come after me because I was away from God. And every time I tried to reason it and tried to say, okay, well, does that even make sense? I kind of thought to myself, you know, if I hadn't left the church and this happened, people would say, oh, well, it's not your fault. Oh, the devil's attacking you because you're a strong Christian. And people did say things like that. And how could you really tell the difference between the devil attacking you if things were going good and the devil attacking you if things were going badly? And at the same time of dealing with this sort of fear that I had caused this in some way by my actions, I had people saying to me that God had spared me. I was very surprised at how common this was. My aunt told me this, a random person when I stopped at work told me this, other people told me this, like people I didn't even know that well were like, oh man, you're so lucky, and considering how much you've been through, you're doing so well considering, and that paramedic was off duty and he helped you, God was with you. And I'm just sitting there like, really? You're saying that you know God was with me, and this other person is saying, oh, it's because you left the church. Isn't it more reasonable to say you just don't know? To just say that it happened? And the more I thought about it, the more I said to myself, you know, I know exactly why this happened. This happened because I decided to get in a big metal object that travels at a fast speed, and another person who also decided to get in their big metal object that travels at a fast speed hit me. You always have a risk when you're doing things like this. Just being alive, there's always a risk that something's gonna happen. That's life. It doesn't have to be fair. It doesn't have to be ordained. I can't think of one time I ever said to myself, how dare you, God, let this happen? I just didn't. I mean, the whole God spared you thing seems silly because God could have prevented it, but I didn't deserve some divine bubble around me just like no one else did. Everybody has risks, and I didn't view myself as above anyone else when it comes to these kind of risks. I mean, I might have made a mistake in driving. I don't know. I don't remember. To place myself in a sort of God blessed me or something, God spared me, it seemed really unfair, because what about the people God didn't spare? I didn't think that was fair to think. I didn't think that was right or ethical to think. I didn't view myself as above anyone. I was just very fortunate, and trust me, I knew I was fortunate. I was very thankful, and I felt the most peace when I just realized that bad things happen sometimes. And that was a really healthy thing, I think, for me. Just like I realized that as a Christian I didn't know. I was an agnostic Christian. No one else did either. And it wasn't fair for them to claim that they knew the mind of God. And I found this to be really unfair to God, honestly. I kind of thought, well, yeah, I think I have a relationship with God, but to claim that I know something in somebody else's life, it's to claim that I know why some things happen was just, I felt like God could not be happy with that. Even in the Bible, sometimes God did things that other people didn't understand. To believe that God has blessed you can be a nice feeling, but there is a darker side to that that can come from believing that your life has these spiritual components, this sort of spiritual warfare undertone to your life. Just because sometimes it makes you feel good that, oh, maybe I was blessed for something, or, you know, God is allowing something good to happen. I felt like there was a flip side. After experiencing that flip side in such a strong way, even though I still believed in God and I was still a Christian, I knew that I would never try to attribute certain events to God because I just didn't know.